audio circuit. This is the United States Information Agency transmitting on the program audio circuit. This is the United States Information Agency transmitting on the program audio circuit. This is the United States Information Agency transmitting on the program audio circuit. This
WorldNet presents Dialogue, an unrehearsed televised exchange of ideas. Now, from our studios in Washington, D.C., here is your host, broadcast journalist, Paul Duke.
Good afternoon and welcome to WorldNet's Dialogue. For our world audience and participants in Lagos, Harare, Kampala, and Frankfurt, we present another special program in celebration of Black History Month. Andrew J. Young was born March 12, 1932. Growing up in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, his parents distilled in him the powers of faith, perseverance, and independence, characteristics that later became evident in his career. Although he considered himself an average student, he obtained the first of numerous college degrees at age 19 from Howard University here in Washington. In 1954, he married Jean Child, whom he met while serving as a minister in Alabama. Soon he was involved in the burgeoning civil rights movement, working with Dr. Martin Luther King. This was the beginning of the many accomplishments that followed.
What turned out to be a lifelong association with Dr. Martin Luther King began coincidentally when Andrew Young attended a rally where Dr. King was speaking. It was that night that Young met the man who had the greatest impact on his life. Young was there when Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. The world lost a leader. Andrew Young lost his mentor.
And my first reaction was that if anybody had earned the reward of a life with God, that he was certainly entitled to the peace that I think as a Christian comes with death. But then I began to get mad, and I began to get upset that he was going on to heaven to claim his reward, but leaving us with all his mess.
That mess, however, was swept aside by the accomplishments that had been gained by the civil rights leaders who continued in the struggle for equality for blacks in the United States. Andrew Young went on to become the first black congressman from the southern region of America, and under the Carter administration he became a UN ambassador. The accomplishments did not stop there. Andrew Young had a vision which he took to the city of Atlanta, Georgia, where in 1982 he became mayor. He worked with the citizens of Atlanta, building the city's reputation, which now holds the title of the Gateway to America. In 1988, the eyes of the world were on Mayor Young as the city of Atlanta hosted the Democratic National Convention. Andrew Young, husband, father, clergyman, civil rights leader.
Thank you, and welcome to Atlanta.
And we're pleased to have in the studios with us today Mayor Andrew Young. Nice to see you again, Mr. Mayor.
It's always good to be here and to see so many of my friends here, but particularly to have an opportunity to share with my friends abroad.
Mr. Mayor, we now have a new president, and we know that you and many other figures who graduated from the civil rights movement many years ago are now very prominent in American politics and American government. With George Bush having taken office, what do you now see as the goals that you would like to see the new administration achieve in the civil rights area?
Well, I think one at home and one abroad. The one at home would probably be to address the problems of housing for the poorest of the poor. That is, working people who are in substandard housing and the homeless that are afflicting our cities and are being afflicted by the problems of our cities. The other is Southern Africa. We are very much concerned about a peaceful transition in Namibia with United States government support of free and fair elections there beginning this April. And we really do believe that the Bush administration could use a little of its influence to get Nelson Mandela out of jail and to begin a process of a peaceful transition toward majority rule in South Africa.
All right, and with that as a kickoff, let us now turn to our participants for their questions and comments. I'd like to remind all of the participants to identify yourselves before commenting or before asking your questions. We'll begin with Harare. Go ahead, please, with the opening question.
My name is Herbert Munangatire from Harare. May I ask? The United States government has so far supported UNITA in the present arrangement. President Kaunda of Zambia has called it immoral. What can African Americans do to reverse President Bush's policy in this regard?
Well, I think the Bush administration could become far more sensitive to African opinion on UNITA. That's one of the disappointments we have there. But I was speaking with some of my colleagues, former colleagues at the United Nations, and there are complications there. One, the links that have traditionally existed between UNITA and SWAPO, for instance. Not that there's any political link, but essentially they've been involved in the same region. That SWAPO beginning to move into Namibia and take a part in the election is going to be in a position to work with the government of Angola and with the government of Zambia to try to bring some resolution to that problem. I really think that the United States has to let Africans solve this problem. And I would hope that the Bush administration would not be involved in any further military activities on the African continent, particularly in Southern Africa.
All right, now we'll move along with an opening question from Kampala. Please go ahead with your first question.
If I hear you correctly, you're asking what the main difference is between Bush and Reagan in regard to the black community. I'd say there's a tremendous difference. For one, I think that President Reagan never knew the black community. He grew up in small towns in Illinois and lived most of his life in Hollywood. During the entire time that he was governor of California, there was nobody black that was associated with him. So he really did not know what was going on in the black community during most of his adult life. That's not true of George Bush. President Bush has been involved with the black community. His wife has been on the board of Morehouse College Medical School. He's been very much involved in the politics of Atlanta as vice president. He grew up, or his political life has been in Houston, a town with a heavy black population and Hispanic population. He's traveled around the world. So I think we can count on Bush being much more sensitive, but more important, much more knowledgeable about the affairs of blacks in America and around the world than President Reagan was.
All right, we'll move along next to Frankfurt. Would you please come in, Frankfurt?
Mayor. I am Jutta Himmelreich, assistant to the director of the Center for North American Studies and Research. I will have to say 2 introductory sentences before actually asking my question. Many people preoccupied by the current situation of deteriorating living conditions and lack of positive incentives in the so-called ghetto life seem to see part of a remedy in the provision of better education from the elementary level onwards. Other people put the blame on the concerned quote-unquote victims of ghetto life by saying that they lack enthusiasm to accept responsibility for themselves and others. My question may sound harsh, but more suitable words elude me at the time. Isn't the persistence of racism the first and foremost reason for the persistence of the regrettable state of affairs of the so-called members of minorities in the United States?
I think that I would have to agree with you that the presence of racism is one of the more persistent factors in the condition of minorities in the United States. But it's more than just racism, because you see some of the same sorts of things happening to people who are white. I rather think that we see problems for the poor in America, black and white and brown and Asian in some areas, that our economy has, by and large, been in a transition for the last decade. We're moved away from manufacturing to an information society that requires more skills and education. We've left behind a significant number of citizens, and they're not all black. In fact, most of them are white. The fastest growing group of people in poverty in America today are white males. That's a new phenomenon, and you can't attribute that to racism. I think part of it is America having to adjust its economy to prepare for the 21st century. And right now, there's some people being left behind. That's true of our cities. It's true of our rural areas and small towns, where in Georgia, for instance, we've been losing about 2,000 family farms a year. And most of those farms are owned by whites. So we do have some problems in America, even while our economy is growing, and in a city like Atlanta, new investment and new jobs are flourishing, but we still have some people that are not a part of that progress.
All right, please stand by, Frankfurt. We'll move along now to Lagos. Please go ahead, Lagos. Would you please come in, Lagos? Please come in, Lagos. We appear to be having technical difficulties. Are you there, Lagos? Can you hear us? We'd like an opening question if indeed you can hear us. Well, we still have those things called technical difficulties, Mr. Mayor,
Yeah.
even at this advanced age. We'll move along now to Harare. Another question from Harare, please.
I'm Gibson to Local Testing Corporation in Harare. Mayor, I wanted you to let us know what your attitude or the attitude of the African American is towards American military adventures or support abroad, say for the Contras in the Middle East and so on and so forth. I would also like you to let us know what your attitude is towards movements such as the African National Congress of South Africa or the PLO in the Middle East.
Well, I think that African Americans have tended to be very supportive of liberation movements. We feel a common kinship with those liberation movements because we believe that most of those liberation movements have similar origins to our civil rights movements. That is, they come up out of the teaching of the church. And I'm very fond of telling of my experiences in Zimbabwe because while we were trying to say that this was a Marxist terrorist movement, it was led by Robert Mugabe, a devout Roman Catholic, and Joshua Nkomo, a Presbyterian lay preacher, Abel Muzorewa, a bishop of a Methodist church, and Dabaningi Satole, a minister of the United Church of Christ. The same sort of thing is true in Nicaragua. When I was in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas are almost all educated in Christian missionary schools. Most of their leadership did their university training in the United States. Palestinians were educated at the American University in Beirut. So there's a common link of the Judeo-Christian tradition of justice and the Western tradition of higher education. Almost everywhere you find a liberation movement, that's the case. In the Sudan, for instance, the SPLA is led by a young man, John Garang, who studied at Grinnell College in Iowa and got his PhD from Iowa State University. So that the movement for change in the world, to me, is directly related to the educational accomplishments and the teachings of the church. Now, the United States government has never been willing to see it that way. We came pretty close under Jimmy Carter. But I think as we understand liberation movements as part of the rising tide of expectations and aspirations amongst educated people in the developing world, we're going to relate to it more effectively. And even the African National Congress, there are no more distinguished lawyers produced by South Africa than Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo. And you meet younger men in the African National Congress, and they're all very well educated, very articulate. And I say to my American colleagues that if Thurgood Marshall, who's on our Supreme Court here in the United States, had been born in South Africa and Nelson Mandela had been born here, it's quite possible that Nelson Mandela would be on our Supreme Court and Thurgood Marshall would be in jail. It is a movement that we need to embrace. It's a movement that's directly related to what America's founding fathers talked about. And that is the notion that all men, and we would say nowadays even women and children, are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And there's something in human nature that makes us want to express those rights and determine our own destiny. And once we get to a certain level of education and a certain level of cultural security, we're going to fight to be free. Now, we viewed this largely in the context of the United States and the Third World growing out of colonialism. But I think you see the same sort of thing happening in the East now. And I would say the Solidarity movement in Poland is an outgrowth of people's faith challenging their government. The human rights expectations that you see across the Soviet Union, the emergence of freedom movements that led to the overthrow of Marcos regime were all rooted in the church and in American education. So it's time, I think, that we claimed our own and gave them democratic means of achieving their just goals of self-determination.
Tomorrow, our people here have been celebrating Black American History Week. I myself, as a trustee of Zimbabwe American Society, have been through these events. Now, we have discussed, among other things, at our meeting this afternoon, possible linkage between Black Americans and we here in Africa, Zimbabwe in particular. One of the things that we discussed was question of sanctions against South Africa. Now, do you think they should be selective? Or do you think they can bring about any change?
Well, let me say I've always been an advocate of sanctions, but I am an advocate of selective sanctions. And that's because I don't think you can monitor general sanctions. I think your experience in Zimbabwe when it was Rhodesia is illustrative. The Rhodesian economy was not damaged. It was in some ways strengthened by sanctions. But that doesn't mean that sanctions don't work. Our own experience in the United States was that general sanctions were very difficult to enforce, and people usually got tired and they relaxed. But specific sanctions, and I've been an advocate of an airline embargo. And what I would wish that the United States and the Organization of African Unity and the Commonwealth nations would do together would be to go to the United Nations and vote for an airline sanction against South Africa. Not to begin immediately, but to begin, say, in July, giving them time to do what is required. And what I would require of them would be the release of Nelson Mandela and the political prisoners and the beginning of discussions toward a constitutional process. Now, if we gave them from now until July, some 6 months, to do that, and they did not do that, then I would say that no airplanes should cross into South African airspace. That airline embargo could be monitored because we track airplanes. We don't track ships. We can't track ships on the open waters. We can track aircraft. And through the International Civil Aeronautics Organization, you could make sure that any planes that crossed into South African airspace would not be able to land anywhere else in the world. That kind of isolation would put a direct punishment or incentive on the people who profit most by apartheid. It wouldn't hurt the poor. It would hurt those people who fly their gold and diamond shipments out every day, those people who travel 3 and 4 times a year to Europe and America, and it would inconvenience them as apartheid inconveniences the rest of the world. Our experience in the United States is when people are inconvenienced by segregation and racism, particularly when it begins to impact on their wealth, then they're willing to discuss change. But it can't be just the United States. It has to be the United Nations in mandatory sanctions. That wouldn't hurt Zimbabwe. I would say that it would only make people drive from South Africa into Harare or into Zambia or into Mozambique. It would make South Africa more dependent on her African neighbors. It would mean that white South Africans would have to spend an evening or a day in another frontline state before going to Europe. So they would begin to see that life in Zimbabwe, in Harare, is better now than it was under Ian Smith. And indeed, whites are doing much better. And it would probably involve South Africans in an educational process that I think would facilitate an end to apartheid.
All right, thanks, Harare, for that series of questions. We'd like to try now once more to bring in Lagos.
Mayor Young, my name is Nduka Irabo. I did the African Guide and published in Lagos. Still on the question of sanctions, whether general or specific sanctions, I would want you to make some prediction. Do you foresee the Bush administration having any major policy change in the question of sanction against South Africa? President Bush, or rather President Reagan, with whom Bush worked closely with, continuously sabotaged the agitation for sanction against South Africa.
Well, I don't know what to think about that. I would hope that President Bush, having been the United States ambassador to the United Nations, would be more understanding and more appreciative of the powerful role that the United Nations can play in bringing about an end to apartheid. And I think we'll see very soon, as we see the administration develop a policy toward the peaceful transition of Namibia. And I think we can count on the Bush administration to be very supportive of a peaceful transition in Namibia. And when they see firsthand the effectiveness of the United Nations in that kind of situation, I think we will probably see sometimes this summer the Bush administration willing to at least engage Margaret Thatcher and Great Britain. The reason President Reagan gave for not supporting United Nations sanctions was his alliance with Margaret Thatcher and England. I hope that that won't continue to hurt the United States, because I think that's a policy that in the long run hurts Great Britain as well.
Mr. Young, debts owed the developed countries by the third world countries has grown astronomically. And as things stand now, with the depression in the economy, servicing and repayment of this debt seem to be out of place. How in specific ways will the Bush administration assist the third world countries to make the economies more tolerable? My name is Victor Ayodele. I write for This Week magazine, published in Lagos.
You know, the Bush administration has got to deal with the debt crisis in the United States first. And the two are not unrelated. I think that something that has been called for by the developing countries of the world for some time has got to become an item for discussion. I don't think the United States is ready as yet. But the question of debt is related to the question of interest rates. The reason we see Germany and Japan as thriving industrial nations right now is that the United States provided interest rates of 3 to 6%, a free flow of capital, open markets, and an exchange of technology that had little or no limit. And for 25 years, we had that kind of partnership through the Marshall Plan with Japan and with Europe. And so Europe had 25 years of low interest and stable currencies to recover with technical assistance and capital from the United States. We at least ought to be able to do that well with the developing world. We ought to be able to guarantee some stabilization of the global economy, stabilization of the values of currencies, stabilization of interest rates. And I think with reasonable interest rates and stable currency and with free trade, I think we can see the developing world begin to work its way out of debt, as I think we'll see the United States work its way out of debt. Right now, we are the largest debtor nation in the world, and we've got to encourage policies that are going to help us recover from our debtor status.
Mr. Young?
Yes.
This is Jeffrey Light, Deputy Director of USIS.
Lagos with a question from one of our viewers in Kaduna, which is joining WorldNet for the first time. The question is from T.D. Nganga of Today newspaper, and this is the question. Are you satisfied with the Bush's appointments so far in terms of minority representation?
Well, I think that we have to see what Bush is going to do beyond the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I think that Dr. Louis Sullivan, heading up one of the largest agencies in the government, is a very good appointment. I think the key to Bush's appointments for black Americans or African Americans is going to be the kind of person he begins to appoint to the judicial system. He will have a lot of judicial appointments, including at sometimes perhaps appointments to the Supreme Court. And I think we'll get a better flavor of what President Bush will leave as his legacy in human rights as we get beyond the initial cabinet appointments. I was always an advocate of our group being more concerned about those positions in the cabinet and in the agencies that actually control budgets and make policy. I think my position at the United Nations was basically a ceremonial position. And I think many of the top cabinet positions are ceremonial positions. What you really sense about the policy is who are the people at the second and third level where the budgets are being directed.
Mr. Young, in the midst of the economic boom generated by Reaganomics, blacks lost their jobs, were pushed lower in the United States economic ladder. It's a bit puzzling that poll results suggest blacks are favorably disposed to Bush, although I think it's quite early in the day. Do you imagine that blacks would have a better deal under Bush? Or is there anything really tangible that has happened in the United States now that supports these poll results?
I think we've got to have a better deal under President Bush. President Bush is a more knowledgeable person about the affairs of urban America. He's a more knowledgeable person about the affairs of the developing world. And I think there is a commitment in the Republican Party now that at least is going to try. I think they began to realize that they were leaning too far to the right on human rights and race relations at home. And we have seen in the last week a former member of the Ku Klux Klan elected to the state house in the state of Louisiana. And we saw the president and former President Reagan and the Republican National Committee working against the election of that Ku Klux Klan member. But he got elected anyway. And I think that served as a warning to the Bush administration and to the Republican Party that they have to make some serious efforts not to continue to be branded in the minds of most Americans as subtly and unconscious, if not consciously, racist.
We'll now move along to Kampala. Would you please come in with additional questions?
Hello, Akiki Mojaju, Dean of Social Sciences at Makerere University in Kampala. Andrew Young, it's very good to see you on our program and to participate with you. I have always admired the views you have had in connection with the need to separate needs and movements for change in Africa and elsewhere from the East-West relations. Frequently, we fail to do that. And I suppose I am glad that you have restated this position this afternoon. The question that I have really is in relation to the way the blacks in the United States and Africans here in Africa, in our continent, can assist each other. When I was a student in New York in the 60s, obviously the blacks were very meagerly represented in various organs of government. The position has now changed. You're a mayor, and there are many members of Congress who are blacks. So there is a platform upon which some action could be taken. And we here in the continent, there are only a few countries remaining to be independent. How, in concrete ways, do you see us assisting each other in order to extend the frontiers of freedom and opportunity?
Well, I think there has to be some mutual economic assistance. Fortunately now, there are black Americans in decision-making positions throughout American industry. And America is going to need to trade. Africa is going to need to develop. And hopefully, we will find a partnership in trade and development. That depends, though, on the quality of business person that goes to Africa. It also depends on the honesty and integrity of the decision makers in Africa. I think the biggest danger that we face in development is probably corruption and greed. We are going to have to understand that we can't develop our nations and we can't develop our relationships if we are going to have African Americans coming to Africa being greedy, faced with corruption in African governments also being greedy. The biggest tax on development has probably been wrought by greed and corruption. And there has got to be an elimination of that factor in the business. The volume of business that we do together honestly is going to be in the best interest of our countries, and it's going to be in the best interest of the relationships. And our ability to take a long-term view and put personal profits in a secondary position and raise questions about the long-term growth and development of our people is going to facilitate the process of our relationship. I think there have been very good relationships. President Museveni was here last month and met with a number of business persons. But very few Americans of African descent can come to Africa to take on major projects alone. They don't have enough long-term capital to invest over a year or two and then wait another year or two to get paid. There's got to be an easy way to do business that involves cooperation of our governments and the private sector in projects of development.
The New Vision newspaper here in Kampala. I have to take you back, I have to kind of come where you are before I pose my question. A Washington Post columnist, William Roxbury, I think it is, recently wrote, "Black Americans are more socially, politically, and economically disenfranchised than they have been for more than a century." He wrote this sometime late last year. And the state of black America, Mr. Mayor, is very important to us as African blacks. Blacks on the continent think that the state of the black community in the United States has a lot to do with Africa, precisely because the way America sees its black community will tell a lot how America will see blacks and other minorities elsewhere. So I want to pose the following short, brief question. There is talk of a gentler, kinder America. Do you actually see a gentler, kind America now taking shape, Mr. Mayor?
I think we see gentler attitudes. I think we see more sensitivity toward minorities. We have not yet seen any economic changes, but it's still early.
Can we have an additional question? One more question, perhaps, from Kampala.
Yes.
Do we have another question? We couldn't hear you, Kampala.
Will the Bush administration pass any legislature at all categorically barring employers in the private and public sectors from not employing African university graduates, I mean graduates who have graduated from the universities within America and who have U.S. resident permits. For let's face it, Mr. Mayor, some of us indeed have actually faced this discrimination. We've had it leveled at us in the past administration. We're wondering whether this will happen within the Bush administration too.
I think you have to understand that that's not a problem that we can help with very much. I think that African students, like any other students in this country, are limited to 20 hours of employment while they're students. And I don't think we're going to change on that. We've got so many immigrants coming into the United States from all over the world that while we keep an open door policy, and I certainly support that, well, I don't think we're going to see any laws to change it, our situation. I think that Africans are being employed in key positions where there are no Americans qualified to fill. But that's the way we face employment with Europeans as well, though there may be some practical differences. The number of African professors in our universities, for instance, is pretty generous. And I think that will continue to be the case.
Let us move along now with a new series of questions from Frankfurt. Please come in, Frankfurt.
Hello, Mayor Young.
Yes.
My name is Arthur Diggs. I'm with the Department of Defense here. I'm the European Field Director for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, recently appointed by Dr. Benjamin Hook. I have a question. What recourse do we have when the highest court in our land has rolled back the hands of time on us when they take away the economic set-aside program of granting American black entrepreneurs our fair share of contracts as it relates to government spending, particularly in our fair share of construction contracts, as in the case of black contractors in Richmond, Virginia? Is this just the beginning of what blacks are to expect from the Bush administration?
Well, I think that that's a holdover from the Reagan administration. But the court did not rule out federal government set-asides. It simply said, nor did it rule out local government affirmative action efforts. It simply said that the local governments have got to be more specific in documenting discrimination, and they've got to have genuinely defined goals, but not necessarily set-asides. I see this as a critique of the program in the city of Richmond. The city of Atlanta's program was recently upheld by a Georgia court. It's now being challenged in the Georgia Supreme Court. But we feel that what we've done in Atlanta, which has required the 36%, we have a goal of 35% of the expenditure of city funds be done with minority and female entrepreneurs. That has worked very well for us. In fact, we see it as the key to our economic growth and development. And we expect even the Georgia Supreme Court to uphold what we're doing in Atlanta. And I wish the Atlanta case had gone to the Supreme Court instead of the Richmond case. I think that we have a better program. Not that Richmond's program was bad, but we knew we were operating in an alien environment, and we knew that we had to back up everything we did with good research. And so I don't think we're going to see an end to affirmative action programs. I think that Justice O'Connor has just required that we be a lot more specific and a lot more strict in monitoring the kinds of programs that we develop to aid minorities. We are doing that in Atlanta, and hope we're going to be able to continue. Well, I know we'll be able to continue.
My name is Vern Fertel. I'm a German teacher of English at a German senior high school. Mayor Young, you know that teachers tend to complicate questions. I hope you forgive me. Martin Luther King had a dream. From a German viewpoint, this dream has been accomplished to a great extent
by means of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the ensuing legal cases. Consequently, the topic of blacks has largely disappeared from the curricula in German high schools. The Martin Luther King speech is still printed in many German textbooks, but with growing distance in time, this speech does not rock today's students too much off their chairs. Ever since Alex Haley's Roots and its televised version on German television, there has been a blank concerning a charismatic message from the black situation in America. The only things we hear about are unemployment, crime, and drug addictions of black youth, once in a while corruption of a black mayor, disunity of black organizations, and at times racism in reverse. The admiration of German youth for the black case has ebbed down. What can be done that youth in German schools regain from a new dream of blacks in America?
Well, let me say that if that's what you're hearing, that's quite a condemnation of the American news media, because there are very many success stories. Earning power of black America has probably increased, well, say from the 60s when it was about $60 billion annually to better than $205 billion annually. We have had an increase in elected officials. I think there has been continuous movement of progress in almost every field. The difficulty we face is that we now take that kind of progress for granted, and the news media tends to report things that are shocking. And it's no question, homelessness in America is shocking. There's absolutely no need for people to be homeless in a country as wealthy as ours is. And so that becomes the news story. But it doesn't mean that there's not a tremendous amount of progress continuing slowly but surely. It's just that it's not as dramatic. It's hard to report success. And we tend to support and promote and report more our failures. I don't know what the answer to that is, except that the successes tend to be American successes. The city of Atlanta is majority black city, but nobody sees the $67 billion of new investment coming into Atlanta, or more than 600,000 jobs over the last 5 years. Nobody considers that a black success. That's an American success. And well, it should be. It's all money coming from all over the world. It's not black money being developed. It's money's green. And a significant amount of our investment is coming from Germany. And we welcome it. But that's a successful city where blacks and whites are working together, enjoying progress and prosperity. And maybe you ought to send some of your German journalists there to report for us.
Mayor, I presume you hope Atlanta to serve as an example for other cities throughout the United States. How and when do you expect those cities to follow in Atlanta's footsteps?
Well, I think we do have a lot of cities that are doing very similar. Los Angeles is doing extremely well under the leadership of Mayor Tom Bradley. Indianapolis, a Republican mayor, Hudnut, is developing approaches to downtown America. One of the best mayors in America was Henry Cisneros, Hispanic in San Antonio. So we've got very good, we're making progress in many, many cities.
All right, thank you, Frankfurt. We have a little less than 15 minutes left, and we would urge all of you to make your questions as brief as possible so we can get in as many as possible. We'll return now to Lagos.
Thank you. This is a follow-up question, or rather, these are follow-up questions. The first one is, what are the black organizations in the USA doing to alleviate the socio-economic problems of blacks? And in what specific ways is President Bush trying to alleviate these problems? The second one is, can you tell us about your trip to Africa and how changed is the continent since the last time you came? And the third one, you are a Democrat, and the Bush administration that controls the helm of affairs in the U.S. is Republican. How does the mantle fall on you, a Democrat, to talk about the Bush administration's deal for the blacks?
Well, one of the things about this country is, and I would recommend it for Nigeria, is that when you lose an election, as we did in the Democratic Party, you become a loyal minority. We are the, the loyal minority in the country, but we're also the majority of the Congress. But I think that one of the things that characterizes this country is the ability and the willingness of both parties to work together for a time at least. There's an American tradition of fairness, that you give the guy who wins a chance to do it his way. And what you're seeing in America now is all of us wishing the best for President Bush, because he's the president of all of the people. And we give him every opportunity and we give him every support in pushing forward his agenda until we see that that agenda is not in our interest. At any point that that agenda is not in our interest, I think you'll see then a return to partisan politics. But right now, President Bush is reaching out to the minority community, he's reaching out to the Democrats, and we're trying to work together with him. The other question, let's see.
Well, he asked about your trip to Africa.
Yeah, I didn't make that trip to Africa. I have not been to Africa for over a year. But I was in Zimbabwe and Botswana, and I was very much impressed with Harare. I have not been to Nigeria in a long time, and I regret that. But my feeling from what I hear from my Nigerian friends is that Africa is doing what we have got to do in this country, and that's going back to your first question. A number of the problems we face, it's probably not fair to blame on anybody else. At least, even if other people are responsible, other people can't solve them. We have to solve them for ourselves. And that is problems of drug addiction, problems of keeping families together, problems of teenage pregnancy. Those are problems that we have got to find a way to address in our own communities. And I think you're seeing a number of the civil rights organizations beginning to spend much more effort working within the problems of the race, realizing that we have got to do a lot more to encourage our young people. At the same time, I think I see the problem of drugs as a political problem. And I think that we do have to require that our government does more to prevent the infusion of drugs into our country.
My name is Justin Saruwa, with Global Custom Corporation in Harare. Mayor Young, following the failure of President Jackson to be elected to the White House, what chances does the African American have to be elected to the White House in the future elections? And would you say this is a ceremonial toss, like you said before?
Well, you know, the black population in the United States is not much different than the white population in Zimbabwe. I mean, we're a minority. And about the most we can realistically hope to do is to share power and to participate in the decision-making. We can influence a tremendous amount of decision-making in either party. But I don't think that it's realistic to assume in the immediate future that there will be a black person elected president, any more than I would reasonably assume that as fair as you are in Zimbabwe, I doubt that there'll be a white person elected president of Zimbabwe for some time to come. Maybe one of these days we will be free of racial decision-making, but not for some time. Now, we've also got another problem, and that is that before you can get to be president, whether you're white or black, you've almost got to be elected governor or senator or have some track record on which to run. And we are electing, I think we have a good opportunity to elect the first black governor in the state of Virginia. And I'm looking very closely at the possibility of being the second black governor in a governor's race in Georgia in 1990. But realistically, we've got to do politics by the rules. I think Jesse Jackson's campaign was very successful. One of the things about politics in America is you don't have to get elected to influence the process. The things that George Bush is talking about in terms of drugs and education and housing, child care, most of those were introduced into the presidential debate by Jesse Jackson. So I think he can claim a considerable influence in American politics, even though he didn't win. But electing a president actually is another story.
Kampala, many blacks in America are extremely ignorant of their African origins. In the same way, we here in Africa get some negative images of the immigrants from Mexico, the ones flooding into the U.S. Will the Bush administration do more to shed light between the two continents? And perhaps as a curtain raiser, the president himself will visit Africa soon.
Well, I would certainly hope that the president would visit Africa, but I don't think it could be soon. I think we're going to have to see the president of the United States develop building blocks, and politics follows economics. And I think it's quite, well, I think even if it had not been for the death of the emperor in Japan, President Bush's first visit abroad would probably have been to Japan. And I think his next visits are clearly going to be to Europe. And he'll probably visit the Middle East, and he'll probably not get around to Africa for some time. That's unfortunate, but that's the way the United States presently perceives its interest. President Bush has been to Africa, though, and I would hope that the African leaders coming to visit him would help him to realize that much of America's economic future is going to depend on the development of African resources and the expansion of trade with the African continent.
Mayor Young, what are President Bush's policies combating crime, drugs, AIDS, prostitution, and diseases, murder within the black community? In my opinion, these adversities have been able to do what slavery and the Ku Klux Klan have failed to do, that is to fragmentize and disorganize the black community. Is there currently a solution to these problems?
Well, if there's a solution to those problems,